Hello everyone, welcome to this revision video. Today we're going to be looking at the problems that Elizabeth faced as the monarch and how she controlled England during this time of her rule. We're going to look at her relations with Parliament, we're going to look at the issue of marriage and the succession, and we're also going to look at Elizabeth's authority at the end of her rule, including a real focus on the rebellion from the Earl of Essex in 1601 and considering how much of a challenge that was to her rule. So without further ado, let's go. Okay, so this just gives you an overview of this whole topic. So within this revision video, we're just going to look at Parliament and how it became more powerful. And we're also going to focus on the idea of Essex's rebellion and how significant that was towards the end of Elizabeth's rule. So in terms of the challenges for a female ruler in 1558, these were some of the key significant ones. It's very important to realise that England, aside from Queen Matilda in the 12th century, hadn't, up until Queen Mary, had a female monarch. And there were many people that did not feel that a female would be able to run the country, not least Henry VIII, who obviously made the break with the Catholic Church, largely so that he could secure a male heir. So many people, when Elizabeth became queen, this is really important for you to remember, expected that Elizabeth would be a figurehead and that her male advisors or a future husband would make the decisions. And to be fair, this is the sort of way in which Mary had run the country when she was queen between 1553 and 1558. However, Elizabeth is a very different character, and obviously we can see that speech at Tilbury that she made in 1588, but she showed a determination to do things her own way, and this is one of the things that makes Elizabeth's achievements as queen quite remarkable, in that she was able to become one of England's most powerful and one of England's most significant monarchs, despite the challenges of the views that people had about a female ruler in 1558. So let's just find out a little bit more about how she was able to kind of keep control during this time. So firstly, Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament would be really, really crucial. So it's firstly really important for you to be aware about how Parliament worked during this time. So obviously the nature of Parliament was quite different in the 16th century to what it would be like today. Now, Elizabeth only attended Parliament on important occasions, but she held sway and influence over her parliaments. The Privy Councillors actually organised the work of Parliament. So the MPs who were members of Parliament, they tended to be merchants, gentry and lawyers. Well, we haven't got democracy during this time, and that's really significant for you to be able to be aware of. However, Parliament could pose a threat and a problem towards a monarch during this time, but Elizabeth had quite a lot of sway over Parliament. It was her that could decide when Parliament met, and most of the time she could make her own laws through royal orders, what's sometimes known as the royal prerogatives. But any big changes to the law, such as, say, like her religious settlement or any tax, needed to have the approval of Parliament. Now, Parliament passed 434 laws during Elizabeth's rule, and largely they were to do with taxation. So we won't go through all this, but you can just see this, that these are the times in which Parliament actually met during Elizabeth's rule. And you can see for the most part that every time they met, apart from in 1559 where they met to agree the religious settlement, they were meeting to talk about the approval of taxes. So they met 13 times, met on average for about 3 weeks a year, and there were 29 calendar years when Parliament didn't meet at all during the rule of Elizabeth I. MPs, the members of Parliament, were pretty quiet and didn't particularly get involved. So only 10% of MPs actually spoke in debates at all during this time period. So that shows that Parliament was largely compliant during this time. But as we'll see, there were some examples where Parliament could provide a sense of opposition towards Elizabeth I during this time. So in terms of that opposition, this is what happened. So there was a little bit of opposition during this time to the idea of monopolies. So a monopoly is basically when Elizabeth sold the right to trade in a particular product. So for example, a good example is that the Earl of Essex had a monopoly on sweet wines, and obviously Elizabeth took that off the Earl of Essex when he began to rebel. So many people in Parliament complained about this, and of course this would have been important to the gentry at the time, because the monopolies were a way of making a lot of money. If you had a monopoly on a particular product and people wanted that product, then once you had a monopoly, it meant you were the only person that had the right to trade that, and then you could sell that for a very high price. There was some opposition in Parliament from Puritans, so some Puritan MPs wanted Elizabeth to bring in further changes. Elizabeth saw her religious settlement in 1559 as the sort of final deal, if you like, in terms of religion, whereas Puritans saw this as the first step on a road to create a more radical, a more Puritan church. Now, John Stubbs was a Puritan MP who criticised the fact that she was considering marrying a French Catholic, the Duke of Anjou, towards the end of the 1570s, and he was actually put in prison and had his right hand chopped off for his opposition. And then there's the great example in 1576 of the MP Peter Wentworth, who argued for free speech in Parliament, and again he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. So there was a degree of opposition from Parliament. As we can see there, Elizabeth responded in that that typical sort of 16th century monarch way, with not particularly needing to listen, but being able to use the sort of brute force at her disposal to keep control. So how successfully did Elizabeth control Parliament? Well, I would argue pretty successfully. She had a very strong personality and was very well respected by the people, so she could use that personality to charm and intimidate Parliament. She controlled the Speaker, who controlled what topics were discussed. She could block any laws, so Parliament wasn't able to pass any difficult laws that restricted her powers or anything like that. She imprisoned the awkward MPs like Peter Wentworth. She could dissolve a Parliament if she wanted to, so if a Parliament was proving difficult, she could get rid of it. And then her Privy Council members were in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, so they were inside people that could help steer the debates in Elizabeth's favour. And of course many of the MPs owed their positions of power to the patronage of Elizabeth, and patronage, this concept of patronage, is so important for Elizabeth's power. And I think that stat, remember that one, only 10% of MPs ever spoke in debate, just reinforces how much control she did have over Parliament. So let's talk about the marriage and the succession. So Elizabeth became queen in 1558, and she was widely expected to get married. Marriages in those days weren't particularly for love, but they were about creating an alliance with another country. We saw, of course, Henry VIII get married to Catherine of Aragon. And really, the other factor would be that also a marriage was a way of producing an heir, and that would be able, therefore, to continue the Tudor line, and ultimately to stop Mary Queen of Scots from becoming queen when Elizabeth died, or another successor that might not be particularly palatable. But there were lots of arguments against Elizabeth marrying as well. From her point of view, she was 25. She could have a long rule and a long reign in front of her. If she got married, she would lose authority to a foreign ruler. We saw that prime example number one of that would be the rule of Mary I. She lost a lot of power and authority to Philip. Giving birth could be risky for her health. What if she died in childbirth? Childbirth was risky during this time. We've got the precedent of Jane Seymour, who died from purple fever a few days after giving birth to Edward. And I suppose her experience of marriage had been pretty bad. Her father had been married 6 times. Perhaps she didn't want to repeat those mistakes. And she also used that sort of possibility of marriage when dealing with foreign leaders and important figures in England to try and get things out of them. So she used the sort of, the potential of marriage to negotiate with various foreign rulers during this time. There were various people that Elizabeth could have married during this time. Obviously, the prime example is King Philip II of Spain. He made a marriage proposition pretty quickly, but he was a Catholic. He'd been very unpopular in England during the rule of Queen Mary. In terms of the best candidates from England, there's no doubt, I think, in my mind, having read this, that Elizabeth was in love, I think, with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, but marrying him would have been very, very difficult, and would have alienated many of the other members of the Privy Council and nobility and gentry in England during that time. So she didn't marry Robert Dudley. The sort of final attempt that he made to persuade Elizabeth to marry him was the 1575 progress, sometimes known as the princely pleasures. And then there was actually a very realistic possibility of her marrying towards the end of the 1570s to Francis, the Duke of Anjou. And there's a real sense of, real good relationship between Elizabeth and Francis, Duke of Anjou, despite him being, a lot younger than she was. In the end, it was the Privy Council that kind of blocked that marriage. The problems of France being a Catholic country during that time were probably too difficult, therefore, to overcome. But they're the three examples, three closest, I suppose, that Elizabeth came to marry, and particularly Robert Dudley and Francis, the Duke of Anjou, and later the Duke of Alençon he was. There were other offers of marriage from the Archduke Charles of Austria and King Eric of Sweden, but in the end we know that Elizabeth chose not to marry, and it was very difficult in choosing a potential person to marry during this time. Marrying would have caused her to lose a lot of power and influence. Marrying anybody from a foreign country could have created problems, particularly the fact that England was a Protestant country and the major countries like France and Spain obviously were Catholic. So in the end, she made the choice not to marry, and I suppose that's one of the reasons why Elizabeth became so powerful in her own right as a monarch during this time, was due to that decision. The downside of it, of course, was that the succession always remained a problem, and it made particularly Mary Queen of Scots quite an issue, which we'll find out about in other revision videos. So in terms of the succession crisis, it's just important that you know about this. Now, a good example for you to just cite is that in 1562, Elizabeth very nearly died of smallpox. There was a real sense that she could easily have died of smallpox in 1562. The two major claims to the throne, with Elizabeth not having any heirs, as you can see there in the middle of the family tree, are the Stuart claim, Mary Queen of Scots, that was through Henry VIII's sister Margaret, and then the Suffolk claim, which was through Catherine Grey and Mary Grey, which was through Henry VIII's younger sister Mary. Now, in Henry VIII's will, the provision for the succession was actually to go through the Suffolk claim, but we know in the end that the throne went to James VI of Scotland in 1603 when Elizabeth eventually died. But it's an intriguing one to think about. What would have happened had Elizabeth died in 1562? What would have happened if she died in the 1570s? Mortality, you could easily contract a disease and die quite quickly, no matter what your status in the 16th century. So it's an intriguing prospect. What would have happened had she died at a relatively young age? What would have happened with the succession? It could have been very, very messy indeed. And obviously, Mary Queen of Scots presents a real threat, and really the fact there is no obvious successor really causes Catholic opposition to Elizabeth to rally during the time when Mary Queen of Scots is in the country between 1568 and 1587. So that just gives you a little bit more information about the Stuart claim and a little bit more information about Mary Queen of Scots. You can just pause that and have a look at that and see where Mary Queen of Scots claim goes through. And then there's some information about the Suffolk claim. So the two younger sisters of Lady Jane Grey. It's interesting, obviously, to know that Lady Jane Grey was actually queen for a very short-lived period of time in 1553. Not that she particularly wanted to be queen, I don't think. The 9-day queen, quite tragic. Her execution in 1554 at the age of just 17 years old. So the succession eventually resolves itself with King James I taking over. He was a Protestant. He'd obviously been brought up in Scotland. Didn't really spend much time with his own mother, of course. And he was the natural successor. And it was really down to Robert Cecil, who became increasingly significant in the Privy Council. He, of course, is William Cecil's son, Lord Burleigh's son. He began to secretly plan for that succession, and actually when it came, it was remarkably smooth. So towards the end of her rule, Elizabeth was widely seen as being in decline, and this is because she was an aging monarch. That sense of the excitement and that youth in her early reign had sort of been lost by the 1590s. I suppose it's kind of like, it's good to think about the Spanish Armada as almost the peak of Elizabeth's rule, I think. But the actual war with Spain and the cost of defeating the Armada in 1588 caused huge economic problems. And in the 1590s, there's a lot of problems in England during this time. There's a lot of poor harvests, for example, food prices are rising, the widespread hunger, poverty and crime are increasing. There's military problems, and all her chief ministers are dying off during this time. So Robert Dudley dies in 1588, Francis Walsingham, Christopher Hatton had died, Lord Burleigh, William Cecil dies in 1598. So, you know, there's very much a changing of the guard in England in the 1590s, and Elizabeth is widely seen as sort of losing power and being in decline during this time period. So you can see there just a reminder for you. I really like that kind of portrait of Elizabeth, you know, that aging Elizabeth, the England in decline, the deaths of those key ministers. And there's the two new young guns at the court in the 1590s that we're going to look at in a bit more detail now. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a fascinating character, and then Robert Cecil, the son of Lord Burleigh. So let's find out a bit more about them then. So this is the Earl of Essex. Now, he's appointed to the Privy Council in 1593. His name is Robert Devereux, and he's a real rival to Robert Cecil. Now, he's born in 1565. He's the son of Elizabeth's cousin Lettice Knollys and the stepson of her old favourite Robert Dudley, who Robert Dudley married Lettice Knollys in 1578. Now, he's young, he's eloquent, he's good-looking. Initially, he's a real favourite of Elizabeth. But he's also arrogant and ambitious and short-tempered, and he's in a hurry. He wants to be very, very powerful, and through this, he makes quite a few mistakes in the 1590s, and he's disrespectful towards Elizabeth. So he's a very sort of tempestuous, stormy character, the Earl of Essex. It's a good way to think about him. He's a man in a hurry. He wants to be in charge. His rival is the rather more placid, more controlled Robert Cecil, appointed to the Privy Council in 1591, very much educated in the ways of politics by his father, William Cecil, took on some of the workload of his father as William Cecil aged, and he's trained by his father and also by Francis Walsingham in the art of spying. So he's a very clever politician, Robert Cecil, and he obviously is very important in negotiating James to become king, and he's also key in the Privy Council of James I as well. It's actually very important, actually, in the gunpowder plot and the uncovering of that in 1605. So what caused Essex's rebellion? Well, the Earl of Essex was very ambitious, and he wanted to be Elizabeth's sort of main advisor and be the top person on the Privy Council. He'd led a very successful attack on the Spanish port of Cadiz in 1596, and he returned to England as a hero in London, and perhaps he thought that he could use this sort of status to really increase his power. But while he'd been away, Elizabeth had made Robert Cecil her Secretary of State, and the Earl of Essex was very angry about that. And on returning, he actually insulted Elizabeth and turned his back on her, which was extremely disrespectful. So Elizabeth responded by punching him on the ear. And Essex, being a very sort of short-tempered kind of fella, drew his sword and stormed out of the meeting. And as a result of this, he was banned from the court. Now, what Elizabeth did is she sent the Earl of Essex to Ireland to crush a Catholic rebellion, in a way of punishing him, but also giving him the opportunity to redeem himself. However, whilst he was out there, the Earl of Essex went specifically against Elizabeth's orders, and rather than crushing the Catholic rebellion, he actually made peace with the Irish rebels, the Catholic rebels. So Elizabeth, when she heard about this, was absolutely furious, and so she punished him, and this was it. He basically destroyed his reputation. You know, you couldn't upset Elizabeth twice. So she banned him from court. She took away all his government jobs. Here again, you can see patronage obviously really important to Elizabeth's power, and she got rid of his monopoly on sweet wines. And basically, his career is ruined. Now, rather than just sort of sit back and lick his wounds and sort of reflect on how he could have done things differently, Essex saw this as you know, he wasn't going to take it lying down. He wanted to restore himself to his power, and therefore he rebelled. Now, Essex's rebellion in 1601 is a really important thing for you to know about in terms of how powerful Elizabeth is during this time. So let's have a look at Essex's rebellion in a bit more detail. So basically what happened is Essex gathers together 300 supporters and his plan is to seize the Queen, remove Robert Cecil from court, and make himself powerful. Now, rumours of the plan spread through London, and actually this is fascinating. Actually, on the 7th of February, Essex's supporters, they put on a performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II at the Globe Theatre. Now, this play includes a scene where the king is overthrown. So the message in this is really, really clear in terms of Essex is mounting a rebellion and talking about overthrowing Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is furious when she hears about this. She knows what the message is, and she summons him to court. And this is what actually happens during the rebellion. Essex refuses to appear before the Privy Councillors. So 4 Privy Councillors are sent to his home to arrest him. And they go to his house, which is called Essex House. They're taken hostage by Essex, and Essex then marches into London with his supporters. However, Elizabeth is able to rely on her soldiers, who block his route home. There's a little bit of fighting, a couple of people are killed, but Essex manages to escape home by the River Thames. Pretty much what happens is those supporters that he gathered, when they see that Elizabeth's soldiers are putting down the rebellion, most of his support just kind of dissolves, and most of Essex's support just dissolve away into the night, as it were, and they don't want to get involved in the plot. And the rebellion is pretty weak in the end. It lasts only 12 hours. Essex gets arrested. He's put on trial. He's found guilty of treason, and very swiftly, only 2.5 weeks after the rebellion, he's executed at the Tower on the 25th of February. So the ending of the rebellion, it shows that Elizabeth is weakened, the very fact that someone would even attempt this rebellion, but also it shows that very much she is still in charge. Okay, so thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that video. That's gone through a lot of information about the challenges that Elizabeth faced, but also how she was able to deal with those challenges and ultimately retain control and power in England all the way from 1558 up until 1603. So thanks for listening. Bye-bye.